everyone to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. So we're glad you joined us this morning for today's session on Let's Talk Corn Insects. So these sessions are brought to you by University of Minnesota Extension, as well as generous support from Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. So I'm Anthony Hansen, Extension Educator in Integrated Pest Management based out of Morris area. And we're welcoming two folks here today. One is Bruce Potter, IPM Specialist based out of Lamberton, Minnesota. And then we have Ken Ostlie, who just recently retired. He's an emeritus professor with the Department of Entomology, focusing in corn entomology. With that, I'll turn it over to Bruce Potter to talk a little bit about migratory insects in corn.
All right. Well, I guess if you're looking at insects in Minnesota, we basically got two big groups, and one group is the insects that can overwinter here, and another group is insects that can't tolerate our cold weather and come in from the south. Got a picture of a weather map here from 2014. There's a pretty good efficient transport system northward through the Great Plains. And it'll bring things up like black cutworms and armyworms. Whether we have a problem from these insects depends on what kind of winter they've had in the south. And then it also depends on having the right weather conditions and getting the insects up here at the right time to cause crop damage in corn crops. Once those insects get up here, they're looking for specific fields. We'll talk about that in just a second. They need good hosts, and they need favorable weather here. And these migratory insects, because they're coming in, at least initially, they tend to be pretty sporadic and they're localized. There was a question last week on speaking of migration. I kind of do that, try to do that at least once a summer. There was a question last year on cutthroat trout fishing, and we do that once in a while. We're even successful. That's actually a rainbow trout, not a cutthroat trout. It's not a huge one. My fishing partner there. One of those pests that we deal with are black cutworm, and those moths come into Minnesota in the spring. They like low-lying, weedy areas. We can detect those flights with pheromone traps, and then we can predict development as far as when those cutworms are big enough to cut corn, roughly where we're expecting problems to occur. The small larvae feed on leaves, and then eventually, once they get that fourth instar and above, they can cut corn plants. This is a map. You can see the colors changing. This is last year. Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council has been funding some of these trapping networks, and you can kind of see these different flights coming into Minnesota through the season. And last year, if you remember right, it was fairly dry. We didn't have many thunderstorms early in the spring, and our armyworm, our black cutworm populations were pretty low because of that. Another insect that comes, yeah.
I'll chime in really quick here. I was just curious, what was our last kind of bad year for black cutworm?
2020, we had quite a few. 2019, Ken used to actually started this project back when I was working with USDA surveys. You were working with black cutworms, and we discontinued it for a while. Then we had about 6 years ago or 7 years ago, we started to see more cutworm infestations, so we started the project. One of the things that's changed things a little bit with cutworms is the BT, and that the BT does have some effect on above ground. BT does have some effect on those insects. They're looking for specific fields. This is an example on the left here of somebody didn't have a pre-emerge herbicide, had a lot of grassy weeds in corn. Once they did get the weeds out of there, there was a lot of cutworms that had used that for egg laying, and they'll move over to corn later on. One of the things we're worried about is, we're starting to see more cover crops, and especially with armyworms, rye cover crops seem to be a pretty good magnet for egg laying. And this year we had a few issues with fall armyworm as well. They usually get here, if they get here, they're real late, and we haven't had many economic issues. We did have some this year just because those fall armyworm populations through the eastern U.S. were very high. We got some into very late August, September, and we did have some issues in corn, but it was primarily where, again, we had weedy cornfields. If we're looking at these migratory insects, the moths in particular, we can look at populations with light and pheromone traps. The armyworms are not going to be as susceptible to the BT. We can look at those trap captures and look at degree days, time some scouting. We want to catch those populations early. Most of that feeding happens in the last couple instars. So you've got a field that's infested, and if you're not paying attention, it looks fine. All of a sudden you get these larger instar larvae, and you go to some pretty big defoliation almost overnight. So we are going to get ready to ship out cutworm traps here in the near future. If people are interested in participating in that network, just let me know.
Yeah, I'll put a plug in for that too. That even on our farm, we tend to keep one of Bruce's traps out there, and it's pretty low maintenance. You go out and check it once a day, so it's definitely not a big ask. But if you're interested in participating, definitely get a hold of Bruce and check in with that. Otherwise, Ken, I think we'll hand it off to you to talk more about some of the other pests we're working with, especially corn rootworm.
All right, just a moment here. And so one of the challenges we've had the last 10 years is that resistance to corn rootworms to BT corn has developed. And then we went through a phase where weather conditions and the actions growers were taking and the seed companies' products reduced rootworm populations rather significantly in Minnesota. So for a while, it seemed like even though resistance had appeared, that it's no longer a big issue. However, that's hardly the case. We do see corn rootworm populations rebounding at this point, and with that may come increased problems with BT resistance. And normally, Western corn rootworm has been less abundant than Northerns, but Westerns were predominant in many corn-on-corn fields historically, and that changed with the development of resistance. So then we saw increased production of Westerns, and the relative proportion of Northerns and Westerns flipped in Minnesota. And both Northerns and Westerns have developed resistance to crop rotation. So that's a phenomenon in Minnesota that we primarily associate with northern corn rootworms. It's called extended diapause. But even though Western corn rootworms are theoretically capable of it, small percentages have been detected. For the most part, they're not as winter hardy. And so we tend to see less extended diapause issues. Instead, the behavior that's given them resistance to crop rotation has been to shift egg laying location. And the soybean variant is describes the particular Western corn rootworms that have shifted this egg laying behavior and now lay eggs in corn and soybeans and small grains and alfalfa. So fortunately, the variant has not been documented in Minnesota. We keep looking for it. It's primarily associated with the other Great Lakes states like Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and into eastern Iowa and southern Wisconsin. And with northern corn rootworms, we see populations increasing lately. We'll see them widely throughout the landscape. They'll be, because of extended diapause, we'll also get them in rotated corn as well as continuous corn fields. in a head-to-head competition with large numbers of Westerns, the Northerns tend to lose out, and in continuous corn, the Westerns then tend to dominate. The Northerns have more cold-tolerant eggs. They've been associated with the prairie situation in the upper Midwest for a lot longer period, with the Westerns originating farther to the Southwest and coming north with corn production. In 2020, we started to get detection of Bt resistance in North Dakota and Minnesota in northern corn rootworm. So finally, that's beginning to show up as well. And just a quick overview on management. The critical thing that growers need to keep in mind is that what you're trying to manage has a bearing on what options are going to look best for you. So for all of us, we may think that all of the items on the left are what we'd like to have all together, but different management options provide different solutions. In this case, for example, we were talking about soil insecticides. They aren't going to give us a good kill, so they're not good at managing resistance. They are good at reducing lodging and maintaining harvestability. In contrast with Bt corn, you're getting very good protection of the root system, and in a susceptible situation, good kill on populations, but with varying degrees of resistance out there in the landscape, it's hard to predict what kind of kill you're going to get and what kind of degree of root protection you're going to get as well. And so there are lots of aspects when farmers are managing crop rotation that come into play. We've talked about rotation as being a valuable tool potentially. Other aspects of corn production include the hybrids themselves in terms of their root architecture and ability to tolerate feeding. When they're planted, that will determine things like when they attract beetles, for example, into a field, and what size the root system is when the corn rootworms hatch. And then finally, we have the attraction then of a field for egg laying and other elements besides the corn silks that come into play and are affected by this would be the planting date, maturity, and the weed management. So what I'd like to do is just shift to a different slide set real quick.
While you're doing that, Ken, one question I thought of is you're asking about what people are actually managing for in one of those last slides. And some of us on our farms, we actually haven't dealt with corn rootworm for years, or at least not seen problems with it. I know in some fields, people put out traps and they don't find a single adult yet. So what should those growers maybe be really keeping an eye out for specifically, especially if they haven't really been worrying about corn rootworm so far?
Well, the big challenge with corn rootworms is if you haven't been paying attention to the field, you don't really know what you've got in front of you. Are we dealing with very abundant beetles, very low beetles, resistant, susceptible? Those are all questions that determine, just how much risk is happening in fields. And so on the bottom line, I would start paying more attention to the amount of beetles that are out there. And getting a relative idea then allows us to kind of partition fields into three categories: the ones that we want to keep a close eye on because they're borderline what may be a significant population, those that we don't need to worry about, and like you were mentioning, and then also the ones that are very obviously producing high numbers of beetles and have high levels of potential root injury. That would be the goal of with the scouting. If we take a look at population dynamics, it might be interesting just to think about what's going on out there right now and where we are at in things, if we jump back to the fall of 2020, we had excellent condition for egg laying, tremendous amounts of eggs potentially being laid. Then last spring, we got fairly decent planting dates, and so the crop went in relatively early. That means a good sized system for colonization. The other impact that we could see out in the environment comes from the competition of larvae on the root system. If there's a lot of larvae out there, you will start to see some of them succumb and not get established. But basically, we had good planting dates. We didn't have significant inundative spring rainfall to reduce numbers colonizing root systems. Larval competition is a smaller set of mortalities. So it's in the big scheme of things, the larval competition is really not going to tremendously affect the level of injury because by that point, there's more than enough larvae to cause problems. And then we got good conditions for pupation. So basically, everything last year was working in corn rootworm's favor. So it's not surprising that there were a lot more beetles observed in sticky traps and by people out monitoring fields. And so that kind of set us up with another nice, situation for egg laying about what are we going to encounter this spring. And that's where winter mortality comes into play. And certainly we've had some extremely cold temperatures out there. And so it's logical to wonder what we're actually facing. Are things going to be as bad as what the number of beetles last year suggest, or has the environment smoothed things out a bit and taking some rootworms out of the picture? Bruce and I both mentioned a little bit about scouting and surveys. And for example, this is the results of the corn rootworm survey that Bruce had mentioned that we'll be undertaking this summer. And basically, we've seen over the last 3 years that populations have increased. So if you saw more beetles out there, it's not surprising. In terms of northerns versus westerns, what we've seen historically, I mentioned, was westerns are less common, but that reversed when we got BT resistance in western corn rootworm. And lately it's flipped again, in part due to the severe winter in 2013, 2014. But it may also indicate that northerns are developing resistance, and we talked about that just a moment ago. And in BT corn, obviously we've got populations indicated with the red dots here that have high levels in BT corn with western corn rootworms. And we're even starting to see a few where northern corn rootworms are reaching those higher population levels. So we've got more beetles out there. We've got resistance in both species, and things are starting to degrade a bit. And this slide just shows you that flip in ratio. You can see on the dashed line here where the northern ratio was becoming higher and higher the last few years in this Wisconsin data. And I just wanted to remind people that extended diapause is live and well. And so we've got this shot from 2007, just to illustrate, what's going on. Here we have corn on corn, where we've got BT corn on the left side there and getting excellent control, even with, the higher populations we'd expect in corn on corn. And then on the right, we have the rotated corn. And in this case, there was no protection to the root systems. Or alternatively, the right side could reflect a BT resistant northern corn rootworm population. So it's important to start keeping track of what's going on with northerns.
So Ken, this could lead into some of your other slides you have. We have one question from an attendee. They're asking about continuous corn and increasing Western corn rootworm. Basically, they rotated to soybeans last year after continuous corn, and now they're thinking about going back to corn in 2022. They're wondering if it's safe to plant a hybrid with no below ground traits.
On Western corn rootworm, rotation still works since we don't have we don't have the documented variant. However, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is, did that field get colonized from surrounding fields by, so I started to head down an incorrect track there. So basically on the Western corn rootworm, the rotation should yield a good result. Bruce in some of his survey data has seen some high populations in rotated fields when it comes to sticky traps, but those may or may not have originated from that field, and they more likely represent beetles that are coming in. But it just serves to remind us that these are dynamic situations. We've got pests that can develop resistance, and just because we haven't seen the soybean variant in Minnesota doesn't mean that it won't appear at some point. So just keep your eyes open. I think for the most part, that rotation strategy is going to work.
Yeah, Ken, one thing I'd mention is that, if you've got a year of soybeans in there, you should be fine for Westerns as long as you didn't have a lot of volunteer corn in there. What we are seeing is in these areas that have these real high rootworm populations, and they tend to be areas that the BT their traits have been pretty well overcome. We used to be getting a longer period interval of protection from that rotation. In other words, you might take a couple, 3-4 years to be reinfested, and now we're starting to see populations in second year corn already. So a lot of beetles to reinfest those fields in short order.
Another question that came in, someone's wondering how common the extended diapause is in northern corn rootworm. Any rough percent estimate you can maybe give?
Bruce, you can hop in too, but I would think that most fields are at least in the 40 to 60% range. Yeah. And so that means almost every northern corn rootworm population out there, could potentially pose a threat if it develops resistance. And the only thing maybe working in our favor is the northern corn rootworms. Even though they move about a lot locally, they're not known for that long distance migration. So that means that you're dealing with local issues. So if it starts to appear in your area, I would certainly take notice of that because it may start to affect your fields as well. Any other thoughts, Bruce?
No, I think that's right. I think that, and you've got some data, if I remember correctly, that shows that if you've got some of these BT resistant northern populations still have extended diapause. So just the one trait doesn't negate the other, which is unfortunate. The good news is that even, you've got this extended diapause issue, but even there, if you've got a real bad field for northerns, that rotation is going to help you at least thin half of that population out.
Exactly. You mentioned resistance, and the slide I have up right now is that these fields are producing a lot more beetles than we realize, even at low levels of BT resistance. And what that means is that there are more adults with resistant eggs that are able to spread locally. And you know, and move into other fields if they aren't there already. So just to illustrate the point, here's our graph from the illustrating the field that Bruce was mentioned on extended diapause. Here we have a SmartStax history field near Litchfield, and the light colored bar, the white bars here are the unprotected hybrids. The solid colors are a single trait, and the striped bars are pyramids. And this is the level of root protection. And in this field, because of SmartStax selection, if you look to the right, we see that AMX and AMXT aren't working. We see that to the left, we've got SmartStax that isn't working real well. And then we also, because of cross resistance, have problems with 3111 and 5222 in this field. So that's the root protection picture. But now let's take a look at the beetle production. And if we look at the beetle production, for example, VT triple at that time was producing 5% more beetles than the unprotected roots on the left side of this bar graph. If we take a look at SmartStax, moving to the right, you see that we're producing 10% more beetles than the corresponding Czech hybrid. And then we get over towards the dark blue bar, and the AMX is giving us only about 32% control. AMXT, is getting about 96% control. And then you see the cross resistance showing up with the 3111 and the 5222, essentially producing almost as many beetles as the unprotected corn. So that's a tremendous amount of beetles. Now, will you see lodging in a field like this? That all depends on the weather. And so there's a lot that's going on in these fields that you may not be aware of when you're in a combine, for example.
Ken, do you want to, you mentioned it in the beginning, but the other problem you've got with whether you see lodging and differences amongst these different trait packages is that they're not genetically they're not all isolines, and you've got all kinds of different growth and development differences between these hybrids. So it makes it really hard and iffy to do research like this.
Yes,
There's nothing fair.
And we mentioned earlier that root architecture comes into play as well. And so some of these have smaller rooted systems, and they differ in where those roots are. Some have larger rooted systems and can tolerate some rootworm attack better than the small root system plants. But so it can be a real mess out there like you were talking about. And the danger we have with rootworms is that we're blind unless we actually are out there looking for the rootworms themselves or checking up on the level of damage. So we've got a new trait out there, SmartStax Pro, and it combines what's in SmartStax, the two BT proteins, with an RNAi trait. The RNAi trait has a unique mode of action, unlike BTs that affect the gut. The RNAi actually is ingested by the insect and goes on to attack the messenger RNA that's helping produce proteins. And so with the RNAi, the I infers to inhibitor. The RNAi binds to that key RNA and stops protein production of a critical protein. So this technology is very specific to what it can do, but it requires ongoing consumption in order to reduce that protein level long enough that the insect will die. And so that's why it's paired with the BTs, because they offer a quicker kill. The dilemma comes in if those BTs are already compromised, then you're relying on the RNAi and it's slower acting. And so in highly resistant situations, you may still be getting some root protection, but you're going to see potentially higher levels of damage. And then all the selection pressure will be on the RNAi.
Ken, this is probably a good point to fit in one of the questions we've had. They're asking more about beneficial insects and protecting those. Do you want to comment on what's going on both with BT traits, but then insecticides too, just briefly?
So insecticides are fairly broad spectrum in how they attack beneficials dwelling in the soil or on the soil, moving across the soil surface. And so they can have significant effects on, and that also includes some effects from the seed treatments themselves. The seed treatments are not necessarily highly effective against rootworms, but you can have impacts then of the insecticide. The BTs in general are more restrictive. And so BTs, for example, can vary widely in how much they are even kill corn rootworms, and the ones that are on the market have been chosen because they offer a higher level of kill for rootworms, but will often leave everything else in the soil, won't jeopardize or impair other organisms in the soil. Then when you get to the RNAis, they're incredibly specific. And so you can even have other beetle larvae feeding on corn roots, for example, and they're not affected by it at all, but you even see differences between diabrotica in which diabrotica are affected the most. But the RNAis seem to have good activity against both northerns, westerns, Mexican corn rootworm, for example.
So Ken, I don't know if you're going to address beetle bombing later on, but that's a whole different level of chaos when you apply an insecticide as far as beneficials.
That is certainly the case. And the foliar insecticides are going to have a incredibly broad level of spectrum of activity compared to the more targeted BT and RNAis. I just thought I'd throw in a couple slides on performance of the RNAi. Here's two fields that have a susceptible corn rootworm population. So you see the smart stacks themselves are working quite well, and you see a slight bump in kill with the smart stacks pro. The dilemma is you don't know what situation you're in if you've got a susceptible population like this, or if you've got a resistant one. If we take a look at a resistant population where we basically had resistance to VT triple and some cross resistance to 3111 or Agrasure rootworm traits. Here you see that the smart stacks is still working well in this situation because you've got protection on the Herculex component of smart stacks. And then on the smart stacks pro, you can see that it's working much better and getting a good level of kill in this resistant situation. And let's take a look at one more field. This is that field by Litchfield that had northerns, where we had smart stack selection. And in this case, resistance, you might recall, was starting to show up with smart stacks where we're getting reduced kill. And you see that here where we're only getting a 44% reduction in beetles emerging from smart stacks. And in this case, the RNAi is obviously adding a lot because you're getting 98% control with the Smart Stacks Pro.
And since you're on Northerns here, we did have another question. Someone was just wondering if you could briefly mention what extended diapause is for Northerns. Just kind of brief education on it.
Yeah, extended diapause is simply the ability of a corn rootworm egg to hatch more than 1 year after it's laid. So typically we'd expect rootworm eggs to hatch the next year. If something has extended diapause, they may hatch the second year, third year, or fourth year after being laid. And so that allows the insect to get around crop rotation, at least a simple corn soybean rotation. And that's how you can end up with damage in unexpected places for growers. If they don't realize they have extended diapause, they do the 1 year out of corn thinking that they're going to get rid of the corn rootworm population. And as Bruce mentioned, if you've got Northerns, you may still have 50% or more of them left and as eggs. And then the next year they hatch when you're back in corn. And if the number of eggs out there is high enough, you can see significant damage.
Thanks, Ken. I think we'll transition pretty soon to more questions. Do you have any kind of key slides left you'd want to show on corn rootworm?
So let's take a look at larval insecticide performance real quick as another piece of the puzzle. And we'll end up maybe talking about beetle bombing in the discussion. But there are several new products out there, relatively new. There's Force Evo, which is just a formulation change, and Force Index is a mixture of organophosphate with a pyrethroid. So it's kind of a liquid version of a former granule. And then you have a new high concentration Aztec granule out there, and one that may be registered this year. It's being held by the review of the neonics is Ampex, which is a liquid neonic. And the strategy there would be to get rid of the issues associated with dust from air planters containing neonics that's drifting across the landscape as you plant. In this case, with a liquid, you'd be putting it right in furrow and you wouldn't have those drift issues. So if you take, there's two slides of performance here that are pretty typical. On the left is the unprotected root system where we're getting almost 3 nodes gone. And if we take a look over on the right, you've got 2 rates of the seed treatment itself. You can see even the 1250 rate isn't getting very good kill. We're only at 52%. Then we take a look at the liquids, and you can see that Capture and Ampex are offering that intermediate level of control. You're getting better control with higher rates in this field with Force Evo and with the higher rates of Ampex. But the best performing products over the long run are the granules. And you can see Aztec 4.67 is giving us almost 90% control. And here's another year study. And again, you can see we're approaching 30 roots or almost 3 nodes gone. And in this field, Aztec again is looking well, including the new high concentration granule. And Force G is doing 3G is doing well. And you can see in this case, we've got enough rainfall that the liquids are doing almost comparably. In this case, Force Evo looks as good as Force 3G. But then if you look at Index, you can see it's doing really well. And then you see a reduction in control as you get to Capture and Ampex. So that's just kind of a quick overview of liquid changes out there. And there is a role for adult control, and maybe we can talk about that during the discussion.
I think that sounds good. So Bruce and Ken, one of the other questions is more about what's going on the moth side of things, especially European corn borer, both in terms of, surveys have been going on, but one of the questions was, what are the economics of it, of having just a moth event for BT versus the combined moth and beetle traits in there?
So you're asking if you need the rootworm protection?
Well, but more on the corn borer side of things,
Okay.
I think is what they're asking. But they're also asking if they have combined, basically, if they have a choice of just a corn borer event versus having stacked traits for beetles and corn borer, and rotated scenarios, what are the best options there economically?
Well, I guess again, it's a case of scouting and kind of knowing what's in your area. I don't think I need to share a slide, but over the past few years, Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council has been funding a fall survey for European corn borer. Those populations seem like they're dropping again, and part of that might be because of people going back to more above ground BT. But if you're in a lot of these areas in Minnesota, those corn borer populations are so low, you can probably get by with this, as long as you're paying attention, probably get by without a BT trait. What you need to be aware of though is if you've got an area or a farm that's had a long history of no BT, those corn borer populations, that's where we see them creep up. And we do have fields every year in Minnesota that have economic corn borer pressure. I think right now in the southern part of the state, rootworms are probably going to be the driver for your BT decision. And again, that's a case of knowing what's happening with the beetles in those fields. So if you're asking, is it economical to use the BT? Not if you don't have an insect problem. Some of these untreated hybrids yield real well. But again, it's a matter of, there is a risk for not using BT for either insects. And you need to hedge your bet by knowing what's happening in your field and area.
I know that Bruce and I have talked about what we see happening with some of these pyramided products where we got, multiple rootworm traits and BTs on corn borer or other LEPs. And the potential shift we can see is people going towards products that have something else to offer on the rootworm front. And the dilemma is if we start putting lots of pressure on RNAi, for example, that we could see resistance to RNAi develop quicker, particularly if it's not being used in fields where it's really needed. On the LEP front, we're blessed that we're this far north. Bruce was talking about the migration. And in fact, the BTs offer, with the pyramiding that's been going on the LEP side, tend to offer fairly good protection against some of the BTs, but you have to, some of the LEPs, but you have to keep in mind that there are LEPs out there that Bruce mentioned that if you look across the United States, they've already developed resistance to BTs and are posing significant challenges. So for example, corn earworm, fall armyworm, and western bean cutworm all have resistance to various BTs. And if we start to see more problems with those LEPs, we're going to have to start paying closer attention to which traits on the left side we're using in fields.
Right. I think, Ken, you mentioned this is another rootworm issue, but I think my fear with the RNAi technology is that people are going to put that in these real high pressure BT resistant fields, And there's a pretty good chance if for example, our winter is mild enough on these eggs, they could end up with unexpected injury the first year, just because of that pressure, not being able to slow that population down enough for the mRNAi to work.
We had another follow-up question on northerns and Diapause, and they're asking if it's 3 or 4 years later, is that is their presence much lower? Could you still find a few, or is it really only 2 years later that you'd really find eggs out there?
So for example, let's say we have, and don't hold me to this because this will vary widely from field to field, but depending on what kinds of selection pressure there's been in the field and in the surrounding area over time. But as Bruce mentioned, let's say we got a 50% reduction of eggs hatching the first year when you're in soybean. And so you've got 50% of the eggs left. Well, then winter mortality is going to take out a few more of the eggs that are left. And in the second year, then you may end up with 45% of the eggs or 40% of the eggs. And then you see the percentages left drop. So by the time you get to year 3, you're probably in the single digits, maybe 3 to 5%. The only reason I mentioned years 3 or 4 is that, you'll still see feeding. And in rare cases, there's enough eggs that we actually have documented fields where there's been significant injury in year 3. Is that a significant percentage of the fields? No. So as long as you have 2 years out, if you're suspecting extended diapause, you're in general going to have very little significant hatch left.
Say, Anthony, can I circle back to this BT economics question? I feel like a presidential press secretary. I think one of the reasons we've got into such trouble with corn rootworms and BT resistance is because we've been putting these traded hybrids out everywhere, whether you had pressure or not, and just so much exposure to those rootworm populations. We've really pushed the issue. And I think we're going to see the same thing if people don't try to knock these populations back. That resistance is just going to continue to get worse.
Ken, one quick last question for you. Back on your insecticide slides, were those all applied in furrow? Someone was asking.
Those were applied in furrow. If you go to a T-band, for example, you will see improved control with some products. So think of it this way. If you're getting leaching primarily downwards, when you're in furrow, you're just protecting a narrow zone, and it's only what can move out laterally that starts to protect the rest of the root system. When you start out with the T-band, and if you get a suitable amount of moisture, then you've got, for example, a 6-8 inch movement of product downwards, plus whatever lateral movement is going on. So you end up with a broader zone of protection. The dilemma is rainfall, and in-furrows are available immediately to be activated. And you have to think of any granules more towards the surface as taking more time and more moisture to get activated and move down to where the larvae are.
Thanks, Ken.
I think that T-band, Ken, that was actually in part developed to get some cutworm control out of the rootworm insecticides, wasn't it? Get a broader band on the surface.
Yeah, and indirectly, I know, for example, the John Deere bander at the time, the distribution it put out was actually concentrated more towards the middle, but it had significant amounts to the outside as well. And then there were some banders that looked like you were almost pouring product right through them, and they were ending up, on the surface of the infertile. So yeah, you get that higher concentration, and that's going to also help with seed feeding insects and some of the early soil insects, attacking soil insects if you've got a higher concentration near the seed.
All right, I think I have just one last question we have time for. Bruce, I'll hand this one to you maybe. We have people asking about slugs in irrigated corn. They had problems with that last year. This was continuous no-till and it was continuous corn. Is that a concern for them next year potentially if they had a high amount of slugs last fall?
Yeah, if they did, there's two things. The big thing that drives slug populations, and we've seen even in the deserts of southwest Minnesota in wet years, some slug issues, but it's fortunately we're not like the problems they have on the East Coast or the Eastern Corn Belt where they have more rain. But the big driver is no-till, and then cover crops can exaggerate that because there's keeps things cooler and moisture. But if you've had a lot of slugs this year and you had a lot of egg laying, and you've got some overwintering, yeah, you could have a problem again the following year. I guess if it's a no-till situation, watch it. Slug management's pretty iffy, but if it's a tilled situation, that may help you out a little bit right there.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. And I think we'll have to wrap it up there. This has been a good session. So thanks for all of you for stopping in, for all the participants as well. And again, this was the Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. So thank you for attending. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. Next week's session will be on talking about storing carbon in production ag systems. So if you're interested in that, be sure to be registered for that and stop in next week. Otherwise, have a great day and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.